Well, we're going to get started. So thank you guys for coming to this workshop of all the workshops you could come to. I think we're running slightly behind program, but I'll make sure we can finish on time for lunch. I can just smell lunch, and it feels dangerous to it's actually worse to share after lunch because that's when everyone's sleepy. But a different danger when you can smell the lunch. Well, my name is Chris Ophus, and I work with a couple different things. Wear different hats, but work with an organization called New Life Centers. And I'm going to be sharing just a little bit about welcoming and ministering to our new neighbors. And so I'm going to share just a little bit about our story. How many of you guys I know some of you, and some of you are local. Jesse Ahmed is from Louisiana, so yeah, you as well? Well, great. Well, if you may or may not have, depending how much news travels to wherever, but Chicago in this season, the last kind of year and a half, has been in a season of a large surge. I mean, Chicago has always been a city that's brought in people from the nations, but has been in a very unique kind of surge of buses, mostly coming from Texas, some on airplane, mostly on buses. And so I'm going to share just a little bit about what that has looked like for us. And then my goal is to get to a place where we talk a little bit about kind of practically what would it look like to engage with some of our newer neighbors who are arriving. Let me just pray, and then we'll start. So, Lord Jesus, thank you for this beautiful day. Thank you for the sun, which I feel like we have not seen a lot of this month. So thank you for the sun, and thank you even for the rain. We thank you, God, for the way you have put us in a place where you have brought many people from all over to this city for this season, and we thank you for that. And we ask that as your kids, as your family, you would equip us and teach us and help us to know what it would look like to engage these neighbors, the new neighbors that are moving in with your hope and with your good news, and also just in practical ways how we can love them. So ask that you be with us during this time. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Well, the name of our program that we started, I live in the neighborhood of Little Village. Some of you guys know Little Village. I know some of you have been to Little Village. It's on the west side of Chicago, kind of like the lower west side of Chicago. And Little Village has been, for the last kind of 40 years or so, sort of like the capital of Mexicans in the Midwest. And recently, in the last maybe 5 years especially, that has changed a little bit, as there's been an influx of most of the new arrivals are from Guatemala, or from Nicaragua, or from Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela. So it's a lot more mixed than what it once was. 26th Street, which usually was always like very, very Mexican. You can drive around and you kind of can see like, oh, that guy looks Venezuelan. That guy, he looks Guatemalan. But it's a good mix of people who moved there. And so as a center, New Life Centers is a nonprofit, the local nonprofit of a church, which is New Life Community Church. And as a church and a nonprofit, we've been sort of seeped in that community, which is an immigrant community, for the last 25 years or so. So working with new arrivals has not been something new to us. Our church is mostly all new arrivals. But what is new to us is this season and the way this season has impacted both our neighborhood and the city as a whole. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. This program that we call New Vecinos is a specific program. If you do not speak Spanish, vecinos is neighbors. Vecinos means we had this great idea to call our program Nuevos Vecinos. And then we saw that the Corrals beat us to it. We just shared in the panel. We're like, oh, man. And then we went online and found out that there's 30 ministries that all had that name. So we're like, but nobody did New Vecinos because it's confusing. And so no one picked it. And so we did. So that's our name that we picked. But that's our program that officially formally started in May of 2023. And so it's, as a formal program, has not been running for very long. But even before that, when the first buses began to arrive in August of 2022, in September of 2022, we were already visiting shelters, getting involved with newer arrivals. So New Vecinos, what we specifically do is we were hired in May of 2023 to help with resettlement. And so earlier on when things were first getting going, the families, as they were bussed in, were sent to suburban hotels. So they were all in hotels near the city, but in the suburbs of Chicago. And singles were sent to one shelter at 26th and Calumet, which is right by McCormick Place. And so we had begun to work with those residents at that shelter. And so we actually got hired to help move specifically the first 500 people out of that shelter. That was our first sort of hire. And then the city's fiscal year runs from July to June. So in July of 2023, we then were hired to sort of do all of the resettlement. So for anyone moving out from any of the shelters, we would be specifically in charge of if they needed help moving and of bringing furniture and kind of, you can see the little basket, stuff for bathrooms, stuff for bedrooms, really basic, stripped down resettlement program. So if you could think what a large resettlement program would be, our budget was, I think, something like $500 a household. So we had to take that and go somewhere to eat, somewhere to sit, somewhere to sleep. That was pretty much what we could provide based on the budget and the scale of how much moving needed to happen. And if you're curious about how that works, there's a program. It's called the ACER RAP program, which sounds like a cool rap, but is not. And the ACER RAP program is Asylum Seeker Emergency Relief Assistance Program, ACER RAP. And so that program was trying to kind of sort of copy what's done usually with refugees, who usually are given sort of like 6 months to move into a place. And so a very stripped down, no budget version of that to help people move in. And so we moved in since May 2023. We've resettled 3,356 families. I think next week we'll pass 14,000 individuals. This was from Friday, these numbers from yesterday. Catholic Charities has workers in the shelters who help people find apartments, and then they can also find apartments on their own if they would like to. But once the apartment was settled, then we would get in touch with them. The state would pay the landlord directly, first for 6 months, then more recently for only 3 months. And it'd be paid in their name so they could begin to get a little bit of credit. Because one of the challenges is, even if you could come up with the money, is having credit that anyone would allow you to actually rent anywhere. So that had been one of the challenges. So we do about 55 apartments per day, but that's about to run out. So that funding is almost all gone. I think it's something like 700. There's like 9,000 people in shelters right now, and less than 1,000 of them still qualify for that program, and then everyone else does not qualify for that program. So we do a couple different things. We also have what we call a storehouse. The storehouse would be the warehouse where we do a few different things. Since May of 2023, we've been able to distribute 221,000 emergency items. So that's clothing, jackets, hygiene kits, and more. We work with ICIRR, which, anyone know what that stands for? Lots of acronyms. It's the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. And so they're sort of the umbrella organization contracted by the state that then has all sorts of other organizations, including like World Relief and people like that are sort of under their umbrella. They as a staff are pretty small, but they're like, so that the state doesn't have to coordinate with 100 different agencies. They coordinate with them, and then they coordinate with all the different agencies. So whenever a shelter is running out of hygiene products or whatever, someone will call us, and then we will ship things. So we have trucks that are going to different shelters every day, also to what we call the landing zone, where people are first arriving, to bring them clothes and basically emergency sort of emergency kits, hygiene kits. Recently, we started working inside of 2 different shelters. There's one that is on Pulaski and 27th, which is in Little Village, and we provide client care there. So we do the wraparound services, which is great. It means we don't have to do, if the toilet breaks, we don't have to do anything. We just call someone else about that. But working directly with people, doing sort of client care and case management, recreation. And then we've just kind of been hired to work at another shelter to do the same thing in Hyde Park, which will have capacity for up to 500 people, but we'll see what happens. The landing zone is the place where people come to. Originally, when people would come into the city, they would get dropped off at that bus stop downtown, and that was where the buses would drop people off. The city started to give specific times when people were allowed to do that, and if not, they would fine the bus company and actually like impounded a bus temporarily and then just gave it back to them. And so the answer for the buses was to no longer drop them off downtown, but drop them off in suburbs and then see if they can find their way down to the landing zone. But either way, if you get dropped off in Wilmette or if you get dropped off in Rockford, wherever you get dropped off, eventually you have to get to this space that they call the landing zone, where you can be processed and put into a line that eventually will lead towards either out migration. A significant amount of people have family members in other parts of the country, so they'll get out migrated, or sent into a shelter locally. So we have a team that's there every day of the week. And then our basement, we've turned into what we call a welcome center. So every week we welcome around 800 to 1,000 neighbors who come in, and there's case management, there's support with legal questions. It's a space where different orgs can kind of come in and set up shop and help people as they're arriving. We also provide clothes and just a good place for connection. So that's something that's sort of come out of the season. This is something we've had for a while, but we run a large pantry. It's actually the largest pantry in the city of Chicago. And we have 2 different locations right now that are open throughout the week. It's called Pan de Vida, which means bread of life. And it's open 2 days a week at our Midway location and then 5 days a week in our Little Village location. And so it's free groceries for around 7,000 families per month, and we serve 8 zip codes. And so we see a lot of new neighbors coming through that space as well. And if you're curious what those zip codes are based on where you are and you have families, let us know, and we can make sure to get you that information. One of the things we're trying to do is kind of church mobilization. Like, how do we, and this is what we'll get into the most of our time, is how do we mobilize the church, not just as people are kind of in that emergency moment when they're just arriving, but also as they're getting settled in and they're beginning to move into the place. How do we mobilize the church to sort of come around newer neighbors? June and I were talking. I think I've been in some kind of like vocational ministry for almost 25 years, and I would say this is the easiest group I've ever worked with. It's hard because it's hard work with tons of needs, but in terms of spiritual openness, I have never close, and I've always been working in all that time in a Latino context, never anything close to as easy and open as this group of people is. So it is like Harvest is wide open. People are spiritually open. We had someone tell us, is an interesting comment, was telling Pastor Paco and I, said, "I know where the throne of God on the earth is." And we thought, well, that's a weird thing to say. What do you mean by "I know where the throne of God on the earth is"? And he said, it's the middle of the jungle in Panama, in the Darien Gap. He said, because as you walk through it, all you hear is footsteps and breathing and praying. And it's just a constant all day long line of people praying and crying out to God for protection. He's like, that's the place where, and from all over the world, you have people who are walking through that space. He's like, that's the spot where the most prayers are being offered up to God in the whole world. So it is a group of people who are open. And Ruth could share some of her story with Park. You guys heard Lucette Crawl share about a really small congregation grow basically overnight. There are many congregations in the city that did not exist until this new group of people started moving in. I joke around and say that from Venezuela through Texas were like Christianizing Chicago. They didn't know that was the way it was going. But for Spanish-speaking churches that are sort of plugged in, it's super revitalizing. I mean, the amount of churches just in our own network with New Life, which has maybe 10 Spanish-speaking congregations, I mean, the amount of churches that have had to add extra services, that are seeing growth after not seeing growth for a while, especially coming out of the pandemic, which was very pandemic-y and not super fun, to kind of have this sort of infusion of energy and openness has been really spiritually vitalizing for churches that have plugged in. And I'm sure just in this room we could share some stories. So I love this picture. These are all people who are all brand new arrivals. This was maybe a month or so ago. Everyone wearing a blue shirt was getting the step to be baptized. And so we've had probably in all of New Life last year about 100 new arrivals that were baptized. This is just from Easter week, and what I love about this picture is all of the people in our Good Friday play were all new arrivals. He's Judas, he's not Judas. He's the demon-possessed man from Mark 5. So that's I guess that was our very high-tech costume design for how it was. And this was from a New Year's party. So we're asking the question: discipleship, a lot of marriage counseling. I can tell you we've had a couple moments where we saw. We've done like mass weddings. There was one group that did 11 weddings at once. We have 14 couples that are getting ready to get married in one service in a couple of weeks. You can come down and see 14 couples get married in one service. Programming for children, youth, men, women, friendship and belonging, and then I think connections and social capital. The vision of New Life Centers is to connect people to Christ and community. I think we all need a connection to Christ, but we all need community also. Like, unless you're the only believer there, we need each other. And the amount of social capital there is in someone coming in every week, I have, and I'm sure Ruth, you have this too, where people say, "Do you know where I can get a job?" And you say, I don't actually. No, I don't know where you can get a job. But I know if you get connected to this community of people, some people there have jobs, and when they have an opening at their factory or at their whatever, they can tell you about it, and then you can you can get a job. So asking the question of how do we mobilize the church? And then the last piece is, as we move people in, we're asking how do we give them long-term support? So what we've been doing are these Welcome to the Neighborhood events, which is taking people that have already moved into a community. I'll show you a map in just a second. And then for those who've already moved in, how do we connect them to each other, and how do we connect them to resources, to local churches? And so we've thrown these different events in different neighborhoods where we find who's moved in and find a host church that says we'd like to throw a party if there's a collection of people who moved into my community. And then we bring in the alderman, and we'll bring in someone from Chicago Public Schools, and if there's some kind of local clinic, if there's whatever resources are nearby, and then kind of share about that, do something for kids, some type of activity, and then there's opportunity to meet people and even to see new churches formed that way. In communities where there's a lot of Spanish-speaking churches or churches that are already very involved, we've tried to partner with churches that are already involved. In communities where there's less people involved or less Spanish-speaking resources, that's looked a little bit like how do we potentially start even new communities out of the people who begin to move in. So that's kind of the idea, the long-term support as we begin to work with people. The numbers have slowed down pretty drastically. Compared to a year ago, we're not having the same number of people coming. I think we've averaged at the landing zone around 100 people a day. But not during March. I think we averaged only like 20-some people a day. So it really dropped in February and March. And people were anticipating a large upswing, and it has not yet happened. So only the Lord knows what will happen. I think nobody knows at all. And one thing I've learned during this last year and a half is the person who says they know is lying because nobody knows what's about to happen next. It changes all the time. But what we do know is this is a map representing 14,000 people moving in. You can see all around the city of Chicago where they've moved. I'm pretty sure these are errors unless we put people like in the center of the loop. I don't even know what building they would be living in there, but this is sort of the concentration around the city of where people are. You'll notice there's a pretty strong concentration on the west side and a really strong concentration on the south side. That's where there's just a lot more available housing. On the south and the west side, there's a lot more apartments that have not been leased that are available to be leased. And so a lot of the families have moved to the south side and to the west side. A lot of the south side and the west side are not communities that are majority Spanish speaking, and suddenly you have an influx of new neighbors even into the schools with their kids. So the question is, what do we do about that reality? These are people who are here for at least a year. They've signed a year lease, and so what does that look like? And so a couple of things we've done. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm only going to share this, and then we'll talk until we get called into lunch. One thing we've done is some churches have like adopted families. They've said, any family that lives within X amount of blocks of my church, we'd like to visit them. And Jesse and I were just talking. He was mentioning from Louisiana is more open. It's the kind of place you can go and knock on someone's door unannounced and visit. And I was like, that's actually the way a lot of the world is, and even the way this world once was, where you could go unannounced. One of the things that's often jarring for a lot of Venezuelans or Colombians or Ecuadorians when they move here is that nobody visits you. They're like, in America, people don't come over to your house. It feels weird to most Americans to go unannounced to visit somebody's house, but it feels lonely for a lot of the new arrivals. And so we found that just simply showing up with a little basket, a little gift, welcome to Austin, welcome to a little village, welcome to wherever, we're glad you're here. And that seems to go an incredibly far way in letting people feel like we're welcomed here. So we've done that, where we've had churches say, we would like to visit and bring a housewarming gift to these families that have moved in next to us. And of course that leads to amazing opportunities for ministry and for all sorts of support, because there's all sorts of needs for help with all of the basics of life. How do we sometimes go to homes and the kids have not yet gotten into school because they were going to one school by the shelter and now they've moved and it's too far and they haven't figured out how to get into the local school. So you can say, well, I know how to get into the local school and I'm not intimidated by that question. So let's just walk to school together and we can help you out. The other thing is housing. For some people, they are really, what we discovered is, as things are running out of room, and there's no more, not running out of room, but as the funding is run out, there's a need of people willing to take a risk and rent to somebody for a year. That's another way to help. The next 8,000 of the 9,000 people that are currently in shelters don't have a house set up for them for the foreseeable future, and it'll be challenging. Church planting has been a way that we've supported new neighbors. I know that June and Bruce, you guys know Homero, and Homero was going to the shelter at Irving Park, and then a bunch of the people they had been working with all moved to Berwyn. He had a leader that he knew that was going to move to Berwyn, and they just started a new church that grew out of there, and it becomes a home. Church is a great place to hear the gospel. It's a great place to worship Jesus. But man, church in terms of a social engine that brings like continuity to life and connections. This is an amazing. God was good at inventing the church. That was a good one. And it's just an amazing place for people to get connected. Opportunities for discipleship. There's just so many opportunities for this type of support. So we have kind of a shorter amount of time. We start a little bit later, but I wanted to stop. This is kind of what we're doing. And really the thought, especially for those of you who are nearby, you might be asking, well, what would it look like for me to kind of practically get involved with something like that? And my main goal, realizing this is a pretty short time, would be to say, well, let's talk about that. I think you mentioned that you've been 15th district. Here's that area. There's a whole bunch of new neighbors. What would it look like to work together? Harold, I'm not sure where you're at, but what would it look like where do you stay at?
I'm in Edgewater. I was just thinking two things really quickly. Is there a collective voice that immigrants are sharing as to why they're coming here, that we can advocate for them politically in a way to let the government know how and why they're coming here? I don't exactly know why, other than there's a lot of problems, a lot of gangs, and that's my quick policy. And then the second thing is Andre Vasquez is, I believe, under Mayor Johnson, he's taking up a new role in helping, and I don't know exactly what that means or what resources are available through him. Yeah. So I was just wondering, maybe our church should reach out to him. If you guys reached out to him, I haven't done anything. I'm just starting to think about.
Yeah, no, that's great.
You guys said about how do we support them and how do we welcome them. I'm thinking one area of support.
Yeah, we have good connections with the person who leads our non-for-profit. He's on the mayoral team of kind of resettling. So they're every week in conversations with the mayor's office and with the state. The mayors and the state are always getting along really well together. Just kidding. But there is a lot of connection. And I would say that, the Johnson administration is not shy about asking for the faith community to help. It's not like difficult. There's not weirdness. He's a preacher's kid. He loves the church and would like to see the church get involved. So there's a lot of open doors. The why people are coming, I would say specifically Venezuelans, which in the shelter is mostly Venezuelans. In fact, I would go as far as to say, if you take Venezuela out of this situation, there actually is no busing, there's no anything. It's just immigration as numeral. It's inflation, and it's a crisis that's 10 years old. And you can get into I would also say this, that the U.S. is I think we've had about 500,000 Venezuelans come. Around 8 million Venezuelans have left Venezuela. So we are actually still only like dipping our toe in the crisis. I would say the brunt of the crisis that's Venezuela has been mostly dealt with in South America. So of 8 million people who've left, 500,000 are here. 7.5 million people are in South America. So Colombia has seen millions of Venezuelans go through. Peru, Ecuador, for lots of complicated reasons, there was crisis that was created, which is all sorts of good stuff you can find about that if you search. But I think what caused the recent change, this is my analogy. If you think of South America as a boiler, when the boiler's about to blow up, there's a little hose, right? There's like the little hose to shoot off the water so that your boiler doesn't explode if it's having a problem. I would say that South America had seen millions and millions and millions of Venezuelans sort of exit out of Venezuela and move into other parts of South America. Wealthy Venezuelans long ago moved to Miami and Barcelona and places like that, but middle income and lower income Venezuelans that didn't have those kind of resources suddenly were leaving. And I would say that post-COVID, the inflation that impacted us, which was not fun for us. I think our worst month of inflation was 9%. So it's not fun to experience inflation on our end. Our inflation was pretty low compared to inflation in lots of places of the world. And the inflation in South America and the tensions that were caused by that suddenly made this extra 8 million people living in these countries that were already, many of them, on the edge of society in places like Bogota or Lima, Peru. Suddenly, inflation that was much, much higher than it is here was sort of pushing them off the edge. And so the boiler was like getting ready to blow up, and the hose is Panama. And suddenly the pressure sort of shot people north and up to start walking. The gap called the Darien Gap in Panama, 60-mile stretch, by and large, people never walk through that. I mean, there's no road. You can drive from Alaska to southern Chile, except for those 60 miles. And more than, for most of the last recent history, other than like smugglers or people studying the jungle, nobody went into the Darien Gap, really. And then suddenly the pressure and the displacement kind of post-COVID inflation that sort of hit the whole world, I think sort of destabilized. And so you'll notice that about half of the people that are coming who are Venezuelans are not actually coming from Venezuela. They were in Colombia, or they were in Peru, or they were in Ecuador, and now they're making their way up. Venezuela itself, their inflation, so if you think our worst inflation was 9%, in like 2019, 18, Venezuela had, their inflation rate was over 1 million percent. Like something like 2 million percent, which what that means in practical terms is that your economy completely undid and your money is totally worthless. And so you have to have alternative economies, black economy, black market. We had good Venezuelan friends from before COVID even we would do things at church where we would he would say, we need to help these churches in Venezuela. And we're like, do you want to send money? And he'd say, no, we can't send money because there's nothing to buy. They don't need money, they need goods. Like even if they have money and they go to the store, there's nothing to buy at the store anyway. So can we like raise money to ship actual like food? And the other thing I was mentioning, in like 2019, 2018, which was sort of the peak of the crisis before everyone really started exiting the country, the homicide rate in all of Venezuela was like the same as the highest homicide rate in any neighborhood of Chicago. So that was not like a rough neighborhood of Venezuela. That was the entire nation of Venezuela had a homicide rate that was maybe, West Garfield Park or Inglewood or something like that. That's not like a rough neighborhood. It would have been outrageously beyond that. So it become extremely violent because when you don't have food and you don't have money, that doesn't bring out the best in people. It brings out the best and the worst in people. The other thing is that the 75% of the population was at that point living in like abject poverty. And of that 75%, the average adult had lost 19 pounds of involuntary weight loss. So if you have 3/4 of your population actively losing weight because they can't eat enough food, there's an exodus, which is why this immigration as well is not similar to other immigrations. It's not, even though it gets lumped together in the general category called immigration, it is much more similar to a refugee crisis than it is to normal migration. Chicago's always had tons of migrants coming, and no bus landing zone, no shelters, even Pacific Garden, which is a Christian shelter in the neighborhood. I remember when they first started receiving Venezuelans in 2022, we got a call because they said, we actually don't hardly ever have any Spanish speakers in the shelter. We don't even know what to do with these people who are showing up here, even though the city's always had, millions of people coming from Latin America. So it is a very unique crisis.
Do you see the trend is that they're probably going to receive refugee status and be allowed to stay?
They won't receive refugee status, almost assuredly. They come in under asylum, seeking asylum. So sometimes you hear in the news that the illegals are coming. They're actually coming legally. It's a very broken way of doing it, but it's our broken way of doing it. So so mostly they come and they turn themselves over to immigration, and then they say, I'm seeking asylum. The reality is the overwhelming majority of them actually don't have an asylum case. Because asylum is very narrow. It's like you need to prove that the government is like persecuting you specifically because of your beliefs or some ideology. It's like you spoke against the Chinese government and they ransacked your apartment, and so you run to the embassy and you say, I want asylum. That would be like normal asylum. There are a lot of people who have real legitimate asylum claims. We've met, we have a journalist who works for us who, wrote something not even anti-government, but just not exceedingly pro-government, and had to flee for his life. Another couple that I know that they had participated in a march when people were experiencing hunger, and people showed up at their house and beat them up, and then they moved to Chile, and they got chased all the way to Chile and got beat up there. So another guy was a detective who busted a politician as a detective, and so that was the end of his ability to stay in Venezuela and had to flee for his life. So there are legitimate asylum claims within the majority of people. Their main issue is hunger, and lack of opportunity. But because of the way it's set up right now, asylum is kind of a mess of a system, and you're sort of allowed in, and in theory, in like by 6 months' time, your case would be determined, and you would either be told yes and get papers, or be told no and deported. Because there's such a backlog, most people when they cross over, they're told go to Chicago or New York, and your court date is in 2028, and so that's a long time between here and there. And between here and there, there's a couple options. One would be to hire more immigration judges, which is a very high-paying job, and I don't think it'd be difficult to find people who want to do it, but there's not a lot of political will to do that. The other option is to somehow come up with some new system of doing asylum, but it's not a lot of political will to make overarching changes. Immigration is a federal issue, so this is one of the challenges. So whether you're Texas and your answer is to bus everyone, or you're Chicago is to say we're going to find shelter, you're really just entities who don't have authority to really meaningfully change what's happening, and there hasn't been a lot of meaningful change that's happened at a level of immigration for a long time. So everyone is sort of scrambling and figuring out, in the absence of sort of leadership on this issue, what do we do? And that's not at one party. That's 35 years of not doing anything. If you have a leak in your house and then you do nothing for 3 straight decades, it probably will get worse. And I feel like that's immigration. There's been like no meaningful, comprehensive type of reform that has happened through lots of administrations, and there's not going to be one happening between now and the next election either. So So what they do for some people, they have something called a temporary protective status. It's a TPS, and for some, that's like a loophole. And so for people who arrive before July, they could get temporary protective status, which allows them even before they get their court date to work legally. That's TPS can be like renovated indefinitely. So when there was like Colombians and Salvadorians in the 80s, when there was warfare there and a similar issue where people were leaving, but we didn't want to grant them refugee status even though they were fleeing from a war, which gets into other questions of why do sometimes people flee from war get to be called refugees and some people don't? But that's a different workshop. But they gave them TPS status, and so that's been just renewed since then. So some of the Salvadorians have been getting their TPS status renewed since the mid '80s. They're not fully allowed to be here. They're not going to be deported. They're just in this TPS limbo land for decades at a time. So there's a chance that this TPS will be used and just renewed forever until the court cases come. But it's pretty, I would say between now and next year, within an election year, my guess would there will be nothing meaningfully, nothing that's going to have a lot of meaning that will happen probably between now and a year from now, honestly. We are over our time, but I will stay for as long as you like. I know people have lunch in here and elsewhere. I'm not sure what the time is, but I would love to stay connected. There's a lot of open doors, and if you want to talk more, I would love to connect more. If you have questions that you're like, I wanted to hear that, I'm not in a hurry, so I'll stick around. But yeah, it is a unique season for us right now, and all good. So that's the official Doc Future stop now. It's time, so I'll stop now.